Xtalks is the industry leader in connecting life science, food, healthcare, and medical device professionals. The Xtalks Life Science podcast features insightful conversations with industry experts about all things pharma, biotech, and more.
Hello and welcome to the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. I'm Ayesha Rashid, Senior Life Science Journalist at Xtalks.com, and this week I am happy to introduce a very special guest on the show. We have with us today Dr. Thomas Heineman, who is the Chief Medical Officer at Oncolytics Biotech. Oncolytics Biotech is a company developing an oncolytic virus cancer therapeutic that is currently in clinical trials for indications including metastatic breast cancer and pancreatic cancer as well. Prior to joining Oncolytics Biotech, Dr. Thomas Heineman held leadership roles at Denovo Biopharma, Genocea Biosciences, and Halozyme Therapeutics. Dr. Heineman's experience extends to big pharma as well as academia, as he previously worked as Senior Director of Global Clinical Research and Development at GlaxoSmithKline and as an Associate Professor at the St. Louis University School of Medicine. Dr. Heineman has co-authored over 60 peer-reviewed publications and is board certified in internal medicine and infectious diseases. To hear more about the work Dr. Heineman is leading at Oncolytics Biotech, specifically in the area of oncolytic viruses, let's turn to him now. Dr. Heineman, thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
I'd like to start off by asking you a bit about your journey as you are board certified in infectious diseases and are now leading work in the oncology space. And so I'd really like to learn more about that journey. And of course, there are overlaps in many areas of science and medicine, but how did you merge the fields of infectious diseases and oncology through your work and your role at Oncolytics?
Yes, well, as you mentioned, my medical training is in infectious diseases, and I spent many years working as an infectious disease physician at St. Louis University and in leading vaccine development programs, in particular at GlaxoSmithKline. After leaving GSK, I actually worked for a company in Boston, Genocea Biosciences, which was developing products for both infectious disease indications and cancer. And so at Genocea, I had the opportunity to become acquainted with the development of cancer therapeutics and the potential of immunologic approaches in cancer. Okay, and so that obviously was somewhat eye-opening and really was very exciting to learn more about the potential of immunologic-based treatments in cancer. And so from that point on, I've really focused on kind of applying my understanding of the concepts that I learned in the study of vaccines to cancer therapeutics, and I think have become very very appreciative of the potential of immunologic approaches in cancer, as has much of the cancer field over the years. And so, obviously, as you mentioned, with the increased importance of immunologic approaches in cancer, I think it's become clear that there's a lot of common ground between vaccine development and the development of cancer therapeutics, and so the principles are very similar. But in the cancer space now, there's just so much to do, so many things that we don't know, and so many different ways in which the immunologic approaches to cancer can be leveraged to provide better treatments. That I've just stuck with it over the years.
Indeed, as we've seen in, I would say, really the past decade, the whole new emerging field of immuno-oncology. And so that's definitely been at the forefront in the oncology space, and it's wonderful to learn how you were how you headed into the field and are leading a lot of important work in this space. And so I'd like to know more about Oncolytics and how you found yourself at the company and what the company's core missions and goals are.
Sure. So Oncolytics Biotech is based in both Calgary, Canada, and San Diego, and it's a company that is really devoted to improving the lives of cancer patients by developing immunotherapies for the treatment of cancers, and in particular later stage cancers, and with the intention of, at least the immediate goal, of delivering on the potential of our very promising lead drug candidate, pelareorep. And so Oncolytics Biotech has been dedicated for a number of years now to exploring pelareorep, to learning more about its mechanism of action and the best way to apply it to the field of cancer treatment in ways that can tangibly benefit patients with diseases that might otherwise not have the best possible therapies.
And so, as you mentioned, that the company is really focused on developing the lead candidate, pelareorep.
Pelareorep. Yes, we just call it Pela normally because no one can pronounce it.
Right. Yeah. So pelareorep. And
Yeah.
you mentioned in difficult to treat cancers historically and typically, and those include things like, those include cancers like pancreatic cancer and metastatic cancers, including breast cancer. And so could you tell us a bit more about we talk a lot about unmet needs really in a lot of disease spaces, and in oncology, of course, there are significant unmet needs. However, we have come a long way as well. But could you talk specifically about the two main cancers that you are focused on with this lead therapeutic candidate, and what are the unmet needs that you're trying to address?
Yes, of course. So in oncology in general, of course, there are too many unmet needs to even begin talking about, right? Because there are many, many cancers for which better treatments are needed, right? But at Oncolytics, although there are other directions that we would like to go into eventually, at the moment, we're really focused on providing better options for patients with inoperable cancers, in particular metastatic cancers, including metastatic breast cancer and pancreatic cancer. And in breast cancer, I might add, we're focused specifically on the subtype of cancer referred to as HR positive, so hormone receptor positive, HER2 negative breast cancer, which is actually the most common genetic type of breast cancer, accounting for about 70% of all breast cancer patients. In any case, patients with HR positive, HER2 negative breast cancer who have inoperable or metastatic disease have there are options for them, but at some point during their treatment path, those options become less and less effective. And we're really hopeful, and the data that we're generating at Oncolytics has certainly suggested that pelareorep can provide some much better treatment results than what is currently available. And the same, I might add, is true for the metastatic pancreatic cancer. Yeah, as I think most people know, metastatic pancreatic cancer is a terrible disease. It has a very limited long-term survival rates. The treatment for pancreatic cancer has not changed dramatically over many, many years now. And so there's obviously a very strong need in pancreatic cancer to discover and make available to patients better treatment options. If I may, there is one other common feature between these cancers that I think is worth mentioning, that is relevant to what the work we're doing at Oncolytics, and that is that both metastatic pancreatic cancer and HR positive, HER2 negative breast cancer are what are typically referred to as cold tumors. Okay, they're not immunologically very active, and so immune therapies have not been very effective and have not provided much benefit to patients with these diseases. And so one of the really important things about pelareorep is that it does offer the potential to to allow immunologic treatments to be effective in these cold tumors, right? And so that is a kind of a common thread, is that the mechanism of action of pelareorep is really offers a lot of potential in these traditionally cold tumors that have not been very successfully addressed by current immunotherapies.
And so, to learn more about pelareorep's mechanism of action, I'd like to first ask, maybe people in our audience may not be familiar with oncolytic viruses in general. And so could you talk to us a bit about what exactly they are and how they're being designed to work as cancer therapeutics?
Sure. So oncolytic viruses have been around for a while now, and it's a very interesting and very flexible type of immunotherapy. So it was discovered sometime in the distant past that certain viruses could actually infect cancer cells and kill them, right? And so this led to the obvious hypothesis that if these viruses could be harnessed, they could directly attack cancers and provide better clinical outcomes. Obviously, like everything else, this is much easier said than done, right? And there's many different types of viruses, and they're all very different. And so it's not like a one size fits all. But the original idea was, like I said, was that these viruses could be given to patients, they would kill the cancer, and then you'd be done, right? It's really not that simple. And what became better appreciated over time is that most oncolytic viruses, including pelareorep, really are much better at stimulating anti-cancer immune responses than they are at directly killing the tumor. Okay. And so this is true of pelareorep specifically. Originally, we thought that the main mechanism of action would be that we would give it to patients and it would just get in and kill the tumor. It later has become very clear that while it does do that to a degree, that what it's really doing primarily is stimulating immune responses that can then come in and attack the tumor. And that's a much more effective and a much longer lasting way of actually attacking the cancer.
Mm-hmm. And with respect to pelareorep, is it known what types of immune responses that it elicits? Are there any specific types of immune cells that it targets? And as well, when you speak about the targeting of immune responses and to trigger those responses, it also brings to light or highlights the role of the tumor microenvironment, really. And so does this drug really remodel the tumor microenvironment at the same time as it potentially targets cancer cells, immune cells? And so does it do it all?
Yeah. No, it's obviously these are very complicated questions, but over the years, we have done a lot of work both in animal models, but more importantly, based on samples from clinical trials from people, to help us understand the mechanism of action of pelareorep specifically, right? And so we have a very solid understanding of what it's doing, and it does a little bit of all the things you mentioned, right? So, but to put this maybe in just kind of a more digestible form, it really does two primary complementary things to affect a good result in cancer. Okay, so when you give pelareorep to the patient, it will in fact stimulate the expansion or the development of cellular immune responses that can target the tumor. And this includes things like expanding tumor infiltrating lymphocytes that will then be specific for the tumor and then can come into the tumor and attack it directly. So it does stimulate new cellular immune responses that target the tumor. But of course, those responses are only useful if they can, in fact, get into the tumor and do what they need to do, right? And so the other thing that pelareorep does without getting into all the details, but the other thing that it does is that it makes the tumors more visible to the immune system. It stimulates a cascade of cytokines and other molecules within the tumor that change the tumor microenvironment to allow these immune cells that are capable of attacking the tumor to actually get into the tumor and have an effect, right? So it does these two things. It stimulates these anti-tumor immune responses, and it makes the tumors visible to the immune system to allow those responses to actually target the tumor. And we've shown this in many studies and in many different investigations. And so we have a pretty good idea of exactly how pelareorep is doing this.
Mm-hmm. And so could you talk to us a bit more about the clinical trials and the in-human trials that are ongoing currently for pelareorep, and also in terms of what some of the notable findings so far you've come across in those trials?
Yeah, sure. So we've done studies across a number of different cancers over the years. But being a small company, obviously, we can't do everything, and so we are focusing on the HR positive, HER2 negative breast cancer and the pancreatic cancer, as I mentioned, because that's where our data has pointed us. Okay, and so in breast cancer, for example, we have done other studies as well, but the most important studies we've done are two randomized phase 2 studies in which we've treated patients with HR positive, HER2 negative, inoperable, or metastatic breast cancer. In one of these studies, the first of these studies, the so-called IND-213 study, we compared pelareorep plus paclitaxel. Paclitaxel is a standard of care chemotherapy in this type of cancer. So we combined pelareorep plus paclitaxel and compared that to paclitaxel alone in patients who had this inoperable HR positive, HER2 negative metastatic breast cancer, right? And what we found in that study was that in the patients who received the pelareorep combination therapy had nearly doubled median overall survival compared to the patients who received the standard of care alone. So, for example, their median overall survival was 21 months compared to 10.8 months in patients who received the standard of care chemotherapy alone. Okay, so that was obviously a very promising and important efficacy signal from that study. And so we next conducted a second randomized phase 2 study called the Bracelet study in order to validate that signal and to understand a little bit better what other clinical benefits pelareorep might exhibit in these patients. And in the Bracelet study, we used a very similar population of patients with inoperable or metastatic breast cancer. And we treated them again with pelareorep plus paclitaxel or with paclitaxel alone. And again, we found that the patients who received the pelareorep combination therapy had much stronger clinical outcomes. So in that study, for example, we saw a near doubling of the progression-free survival time for the patients in the pelareorep group from 6.4 months to over 12 months. Okay, and again, we saw a very strong survival benefit as well, improving upon the survival of patients through the addition of pelareorep by well over a year. Okay, and so, for example, just to give you one other, I think very helpful clinical outcome from that study, the patients who received the paclitaxel alone in the Bracelet study, they had a 2-year survival rate of 33%. That is to say that 33% of the patients lived 2 years or longer. In the group that got the pelareorep combination, 64% of the patients lived 2 years or longer, so near doubling. So these studies have shown very strong clinical benefit for the combination of pelareorep in HR positive, HER2 negative breast cancer. Now, if I could just mention briefly the pancreatic cancer studies, we have done a number of studies in pancreatic cancer with pelareorep combination therapies. These are earlier studies, so they are more signal finding, but we've seen some very compelling results. And most particularly in the recent so-called goblet study, we used a pelareorep combination therapy in patients with metastatic pancreatic cancer. And in those patients, we saw tumor responses in 62% of the patients we treated with the pelareorep therapy, which is like 2.5 times what you'd expect based on many, many earlier studies in similar populations with just standard of care. So this signal obviously will need to be fleshed out in larger and randomized studies, but it's a very exciting tumor response signal that suggests a strong clinical benefit of pelareorep in pancreatic cancer on top of the other studies we've done previously.
I would call those stellar results indeed very significant, and so very exciting that that you're finding that pelareorep can really enhance the function or the efficacy of existing drugs, and so that's really amazing data there. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you. We're very excited about this and really looking forward to moving this to the next step.
Indeed. And what is the next step into phase 3 trials?
It's
breast cancer. I guess you're at the cusp of that for now.
Yeah, for the breast cancer, I think the next step will be to move into a larger, randomized, potentially licensure enabling study. We're thinking now of a study of approximately 200 patients or so, and in a study of that size. Again, we would be comparing the pelareorep combination therapy to the standard of care chemotherapy. In a study of that size, if we see efficacy results, that is to say clinical benefit comparable or anywhere close to what we saw in the bracelet study, that would be highly statistically significant, and I think would form a very strong foundation for a potential license application through the FDA. Especially through there's something called the accelerated approval pathway, which allows more rapid licensure. And I think that would be a very compelling story for the agency if we see results, again, comparable to what we've seen in the past.
Indeed. And I want to ask you a bit more about the regulatory angle and the regulatory considerations. But in terms of the clinical trials, I think that just the clinical trial space, and specifically the oncology clinical trial space, has been rapidly changing, developing. And so I just wanted to touch on really what are the current quote unquote trends, I guess, in clinical trials. That's something of interest to our audience. And so I'd like to ask you more about that. Specifically oncology clinical trials, what are the challenges? What are the types of methodologies and technologies being used in the design and execution of clinical trials? And I think specifically also with respect to advanced cancers, because these patients are very vulnerable, very weakened a lot of the times. And so we hear conversations about placebo versus not placebo and things like that. So I'd like to get your perspectives on that.
Yeah, and it is obviously a challenging area to work in because as you say, these patients, have a disease that needs to be treated. Right, you can very rarely and do placebo-based studies, right? And you wouldn't want to because you don't want patients to go without treatment. So you do have to think very carefully about what in any clinical trial you have your investigational therapy, right? And you have to think very carefully about what the appropriate comparator is. In other words, what are the patients in the control group going to receive, right? And it has to be something that makes sense from the patient's perspective, not just from the study's perspective. And you have to, obviously, a therapy for it to be useful in the real world has to be something that patients can take, that they can tolerate, obviously that is safe. Many patients, even with these advanced diseases, including these pancreatic cancer patients and especially the breast cancer patients, even though they have these very serious diseases, are nonetheless very functional and are living their lives, right? And so you want to do studies in a way that allows them to continue their lives, and if possible, that doesn't provide adverse reactions or other issues that make them any more miserable than they would have to be, right? Um, and that, and of course, you want to do studies that are big enough to answer the questions that you're asking, but you don't want to do studies that are, that are so big that you're putting patients at potential risk with investigational drugs that are before they're proven. So there's a lot of issues to consider. Um, and I think a lot of companies, including Oncolytics, is looking for more efficient paths forward, like I'm saying, through the accelerated approval path and approaches like that allow more rapid completion of these studies. And the reason that that's important, obviously, from a company perspective, the faster you do everything is better. But from a patient perspective, it's better too, because you get drugs to patients quicker if they're good. And also the landscape keeps changing. And if a study takes too long to complete, the landscape may change before you're done, and then you might have to start over from a different starting point, right? So it is challenging, but I think I think there are ways to make this all work.
Indeed. And so pelareorep is a first-in-class therapy. And so in the very rapidly evolving landscape, what really sets it apart from other therapies on the market? And if I'm not mistaken, I think there's just currently one FDA-approved oncolytic virus therapy. I might be wrong, but and then also compared to others under development.
Yeah, so TVEC is probably what you're referring to. It's a therapy that was approved in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, for for certain melanoma patients as an oncolytic virus. That's a oncolytic HSV, herpes simplex virus, actually. Um, but I think that there are several things that I think are that have been challenges with oncolytic viruses. But I think pelareorep is actually is very unique and offers solutions to some of the problems that have made oncolytic virus development somewhat challenging. Okay, so pelareorep is actually a naturally occurring virus. It's actually a real virus, which is a class of viruses, and it's found in nature. Pretty much everyone on the planet has been exposed to real viruses at some point in their life, usually in early childhood, right? So it's a naturally occurring virus, and it's something that you get through exposure to contaminated water and things like that. But it was discovered many years ago that certain types of this virus, if they are given intravenously, that is to say, directly into the blood as opposed to taking it through an oral pathway, can actually kill cancer cells. And pelareorep has a very interesting property of being able to kill cancer cells directly, but without harming normal cells. It does not infect normal cells. It will only infect cancer cells, which is obviously a very attractive property. And another thing about pelareorep that makes it very interesting and distinguishes it from other oncolytic viruses or most other oncolytic viruses is that it can be given intravenously, right? So you can give it through a normal, just directly into the blood. A lot of oncolytic viruses have the problem of if you give it into the blood, the body will clear them and they will not be able to do what you want them to do, right? And so you have to inject them directly into the tumor, which is obviously more complicated, difficult, et cetera, right? And so the fact that pelareorep can be given intravenously directly into the blood, it can be administered like any other anti-cancer therapy, makes it it makes it more effective, and it also makes it much easier to use and to test. Okay, so I think that's an important differentiator for pelareorep compared to most other oncolytic viruses.
Indeed. And then when we talk about pelareorep being really developed for difficult to treat or advanced cancers, So, how does its potential translate for more advanced cancers, and why do you think it's so effective for these difficult to treat cancers? And would it ever be also looked at as a monotherapy, or is Oncolytics really focused on developing it as a combination therapy?
Yeah, so all good questions. So um, we are, as I mentioned before, pelareorep has this very unique property of being able to make these difficult to treat, as I said before, these cold cancers, these immunologically relatively inactive cancers. It really is able to make these cancers recognizable to the immune system. Okay, and so it's not so much that pelareorep is is only good in advanced cancers, but it's more that pelareorep has the ability to take certain cancers that have simply not been very amenable to immunotherapies and make them treatable by immunotherapies, right? So it's really kind of opportunistic on the part of the company to, there's a niche out there among certain cancers, including the HR positive, HER2 negative breast cancer and pancreatic cancer, where pelareorep can really expand the scope of treatments that can be used in those cancers. Okay, so that at some point in pelareorep also has potential in earlier stages of the disease we would like to explore eventually, but for now we're really focusing on these later cancers. As far as monotherapy, we have evaluated pelareorep as just by itself without combining it with anything. And it does have some activity in some cancers, but we learned a long time ago that this activity is both enhanced and prolonged when combined with either chemotherapy or immunotherapies, such as checkpoint inhibitors, or in some cases, both. Okay. And so we have been focusing on these combination approaches just because the data we have in hand indicate that it's simply more effective when used in combination.
Mm-hmm. And so, in developing a therapy like pelareorep, what role have partnerships and collaborations really played in advancing its development? And I know that you have some collaborations with various companies, whether that's industry or academic institutions as well. So, what types of partnerships does Oncolytics have currently for the development of pelareorep?
Oh, sure. Like a lot of companies, we have lots of different partnerships and collaborations of different types, right? So we have currently and have had over the years many academic partners and collaborators. People working at universities and other research institutions, and many we continue to work with. And these are very strong independent investigators who are interested in the field. They all have their own ideas and hypotheses and approaches and so forth. And through these collaborations, we've learned a huge amount about pelareorep's mechanism of action. And also, in some cases, these individuals have led the conduct of their own clinical trials using pelareorep, which have expanded our understanding of its potential in different cancers, including pancreatic cancer and breast cancer, but in other cancers as well. So these sort of academic collaborations I think, are very helpful to us and also mutually beneficial to the investigators to help them advance their own research agendas, right? In addition, we have worked and have had co-development agreements with big pharma. For example, the IND 213 study I showed you before, in which we saw these very strong survival benefits. We co-developed. We did that study through a co-development agreement with Pfizer at the time, right? So they were very supportive of that approach, and we worked with them on that. And of course, because we are combining pelareorep with lots of different partners, for example, certain checkpoint inhibitors and things like that in some studies, other companies we have supply agreements and, to help us conduct these studies. So these sort of collaborations, I think, are very typical for industry and very beneficial for everyone involved.
Indeed. And you also touched on the regulatory aspect of things and talked about the FDA's accelerated approval process. And so how do you see the landscape of regulation or the regulatory landscape today compared to in the past? And do you think that it's more enabling of really getting therapies to market and ultimately, of course, to patients today than in the past?
Well, yeah. So I think, of course, I can't speak for the FDA, but I do have a very strong sense, having been in the business a long time, that the FDA has become increasingly sensitive to the need to um, uh, advance the development of new therapies in cancer and other areas as quickly and efficiently as possible. And so they have worked on their own processes for making that happen. Now, the FDA, of course, is always very concerned with safety and with solid data and efficacy, and I think they've done a very good job of kind of finding a middle ground between advancing the development of new treatments while retaining their very high standards to make sure that everything that does ultimately get approved really is um, effective and safe. The accelerated approval pathway is one element of that, and I think it's been very helpful for us and many other companies as a way of getting promising new treatments on the market more quickly.
Mm-hmm. And I think even obviously COVID had a major role to play as well in terms of this evolving landscape, regulatory landscape at the FDA with how the vaccines were developed, and you having been in vaccine development as well, so you can really see and speak to that and to see how that really aided in bringing other therapies along the same kinds of accelerated pathways.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, COVID, of course, forced the FDA and many of us and many agencies and around the world to kind of reevaluate how to address, in that case, a medical emergency. But some of the lessons from that obviously can carry over to longer term processes. And I think you're right. I mean, I think COVID was a special circumstance, but I do think that the FDA really took the lessons from that on board and are, as I said, working hard to find the right balance between rapid approvals and retaining their high standards of safety and efficacy.
Indeed. And so what advancements do you foresee in not just, I guess, obviously the oncolytic virus therapy space, but in oncology in general? And when I'm covering stories and trends in the life sciences here at Xtalks, it's always AI and digital biomarkers, decentralization of clinical trials. And so how do these play out in the real world clinical trial space or drug development space setting? And are these just buzzwords? Are they being applied appropriately in many cases or not? And so can you speak to some of these trends, and specifically, what do you see happening in the space of oncolytic virus therapy? Are we going to see more development in this space in the coming years, do you think? Because it's still a relatively, I would say, new field, but definitely emerging. And so what do you think we can expect?
Yeah, so I mean, of course, I mean, I'm not the greatest expert by any stretch of the imagination in AI and things like that, but obviously these are AI and approaches like that allow better understanding of kind of big data are changing the field, and they are, for example, I mean, and just the things that are visible to me is that it's becoming, the whole methods by which we identify, study sites, patient populations, the best, the best countries to do studies, the best ways to find the right patients for studies. All these kind of operational challenges that are difficult and during drug development, I think can be, there are using these AI and similar, approaches through this analysis of big data does kind of provide opportunities to do this all more efficiently. You know what I'm saying? And so I think this is really early in our field, the application of this, but there are a lot of people who know a lot more about this than me who are putting thought into this and finding better ways to at least operationalize clinical trials. Okay. As regarding oncolytic viruses in particular, it's not apparent, understandably, to people who aren't working in the field, but this is actually a very active area with a lot of smart people applying lots of interesting new ideas to developing oncolytic viruses as treatments for cancer and other indications as well. Okay, and so some of the things that are coming along are some specific things are, of course, defining the appropriate indications, that is to say, the appropriate cancers in which oncolytic viruses may work. Right. The one very active area that we're working in too that is very interesting is finding ways to improve CAR T therapy through the application of oncolytic viruses. Right. So CAR T therapy, as you know, is a type of cellular therapy that has been very successful in certain types of hematologic malignancies, right, but has been much less successful in many solid tumors. But the oncolytic viruses, including pelareorep, provide a potential pathway to allow CAR T therapies and related therapies to become more useful in certain solid tumor indications, right? And so that's a very active area of research that I think has a lot of promise. Of course, there's a lot of potential, and again, we're working on this too, of combining different immunotherapies with oncolytic viruses, and including checkpoint inhibitors is the most obvious, but others as well. And I think that has a lot of potential too, because immunotherapies, while they've been very effective for many cancers, are not effective for many others, and even in the cancers where they are effective, many patients simply don't respond. And I think there's a lot of potential for oncolytic viruses to partner with those immunotherapies to extend their usefulness, right? So those are just some of the things that are being worked on top of the many different novel approaches in the oncolytic virus world that people continue to investigate.
Yeah, it's an exciting field indeed. And what can we expect from Oncolytics Biotech in the next couple of years? I know imminently you are working towards larger studies, phase 3 trials of pelareorep, but what are some other milestones that the company is looking forward to and that we can look forward to covering here at Xtalks?
Yeah, so obviously, as you said, our highest priority now is getting our next breast cancer study up and running, so that we can deliver on the potential of pelareorep in that population. The next priority, which is also very high priority for us, is to advance our pancreatic cancer program and leverage the very strong data that we've seen so far. We have I haven't mentioned it, but we do have some very strong data in other gastrointestinal cancers. Some early data, for example, in anal carcinoma, which is a very difficult disease, but some very promising early data, and we'd like to move that forward as quickly as we can. But in the longer term, which is, say, the next few years, we do see a lot of potential for pelareorep in earlier stage cancers. And so, for example, patients who have breast cancer and then they have surgery for their breast cancer, a certain proportion of those, a certain proportion of those patients will then relapse, right? And we think that pelareorep has a potential to be used as a therapy at an earlier stage to reduce the proportion of patients who may ultimately relapse with their cancer after surgery, right? Which is clearly a very important thing if possible. And then finally, like I said, we have some somewhat earlier but very active collaborations where we're looking at the potential of pelareorep and CAR T therapy to address all sorts of indications. For example, some of these very difficult to treat brain cancers and things through the CAR T therapy approach. Now that's a little bit longer in the future, but we think there's a lot of potential there. So there's we're not coming close to running out of ideas or work to do. We've got a lot on our plates that we want to move forward.
You're just getting started, and it's amazing what the company has accomplished so far, and they're very exciting and promising results. Indeed, like the survival outcomes the improvements in the survival outcomes in the metastatic breast cancer trials that you talked about, just absolutely amazing. So, Dr. Heineman, thank you so much for your time today, and really for the work that you're leading in this space. And it was wonderful learning from you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a privilege to speak with you.
Oh, thank you. No, pleasure was mine. All right, that's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. If you like today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next week. Bye for now.
To join the Xtalks community, visit xtalks.com and register for exclusive access to curated content like live webinars, news articles, and educational videos. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers sharing them and should not be taken as professional advice, nor do they necessarily reflect the policy or position of Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com.